We often assume that the person who pulled away, the avoidant, is sitting comfortably, unaffected, while we're the ones left in pieces. But what if I told you that their silence doesn't equal peace? That the no contact phase plays out very differently in their world than you might think. In the early stages of no contact, avoidants often feel something that can be deeply misunderstood by the other person: relief. And that relief doesn't mean they never cared, that the relationship didn't matter, or that you were somehow more emotionally invested than they were. What it actually means is that for someone with an avoidant attachment style, the space that comes with no contact brings immediate relief from the emotional pressure cooker they've been silently navigating. Relationships, particularly those that begin to develop real emotional intimacy, feel overwhelming to an avoidant. The closeness, the expectation, the vulnerability, all of these things begin to signal threat rather than safety. So when the no contact phase starts, whether initiated by them or by the other person, they experience a temporary calming of that internal anxiety. The phone doesn't buzz. There's no pressure to explain their feelings or to deal with emotional conflict. There's no more confrontation with emotional needs, neither their own nor the other person's. On the surface, they may even appear to thrive in this initial silence. They might go out, focus on work, keep busy, or lean into distractions that reinforce their sense of control and independence. It's almost like they return to a version of themselves that feels more familiar, self-sufficient, unbothered, and autonomous. From the outside, it can look like they're unaffected, like the relationship was just a minor detour on their journey. But what's actually happening beneath the surface is far more complex. The relief they feel is a byproduct of avoidance, not of healing. It's the short-term benefit of escaping emotional closeness, not the long-term peace of resolution. Avoidants often mistake this emotional distance as clarity, but it's really just a breather from the discomfort of connection. The thing is, relief isn't the same as resolution, and over time what begins as relief can start to feel hollow. But during the initial days or even weeks of no contact, that hollow feeling hasn't set in yet. Right now, they're still leaning into the silence like it's a warm blanket. There's no one challenging their perspective, no one asking them to show up emotionally, no one requiring them to navigate vulnerability. And in that space, they feel like they can breathe again. But that breath comes from the absence of something that scared them, not something they didn't want. That's the nuance that gets missed. The avoidant didn't necessarily want the connection to end. They just didn't know how to stay close without feeling emotionally unsafe. So their nervous system interprets separation as safety, and their mind interprets that safety as a sign that no contact is good for them. They'll often double down on this narrative, telling themselves that the relationship wasn't right, or that the other person was too needy, or that they just weren't ready. And in those early days, they may genuinely believe that story. They may feel confident in the decision if they were the one to initiate the space. They may not question the silence, especially if it brings a sudden drop in emotional stress. But this state of relief is deceptive. It's not the result of inner peace, it's the result of evasion. It's like taking a painkiller instead of healing the wound. The discomfort is numbed, but the issue hasn't been resolved. And that relief only lasts as long as they're not asked to confront the emotional reality of what happened. That's why, in those initial phases, avoidants can seem so detached. They're not suppressing their feelings consciously. They're simply not engaging with them at all. Their default coping mechanism is to disconnect, to compartmentalize, to shift focus. They tell themselves they're okay, not because they are, but because they don't know how to sit with the discomfort that says otherwise. And for a while, that strategy works. It lets them move through the world without the weight of emotional responsibility. It lets them avoid guilt, sadness, and vulnerability. They might even feel more in control of their life than they did when they were in the relationship. But what's really going on is that they're postponing the emotional reckoning. The pressure they felt in the relationship, the one that made them crave distance, has lifted. But that pressure wasn't necessarily coming from the other person. More often, it was coming from inside themselves, from unprocessed fears, unmet needs, and unresolved patterns. In the quiet of no contact, those things don't go away. They just get pushed deeper. And that initial sense of relief is the mind's way of saying, I've escaped the danger. Only the danger wasn't the relationship, it was the intimacy it demanded. And as long as they don't have to face it, they'll feel okay. They'll feel like the silence is working. But that doesn't mean it's healing them. Avoidants are often misunderstood as cold or emotionally indifferent, But what's really happening inside them during no contact is far more complicated. Their instinctive reaction to emotional pain or discomfort isn't to express it, but to suppress it. When a relationship ends or enters a period of no contact, especially if the other person initiates that space, the avoidant doesn't immediately engage with the loss in a deep emotional way. Instead, their nervous system goes into shutdown mode. They put their feelings into a tightly sealed box and place it somewhere out of reach. This isn't because they're trying to hurt anyone or even themselves, it's because they've been wired to believe that vulnerability is unsafe. Growing up, many avoidants learned that expressing neediness, sadness, or emotional dependence often led to rejection or overwhelm. So now, as adults, when those same feelings get triggered, their instinct is to push them down and distract themselves. In the early phase of no contact, they often go numb. They keep things surface level, bury themselves in tasks, avoid deep conversations, and maintain a mental narrative that they're fine. The breakup or disconnection becomes something they don't dwell on, not because it didn't hurt, but because they don't know how to deal with pain that requires them to feel exposed. Suppression becomes their armor. But the human mind isn't built to ignore emotional truth forever. What avoidants often don't realize is that their feelings haven't disappeared, they've just been stored. And emotional storage is temporary. At some point, what they buried starts to surface. It can come in unexpected ways. A song, a scent, a familiar place, a song, a scent, a familiar place, a memory they didn't try to recall but suddenly floods back. They might not even know what's happening at first. A sudden wave of sadness, irritability, or confusion hits, and they don't have a clear reason why. That's because the emotions they locked away are now showing up, demanding attention. And here's where things get especially hard for them. Unlike someone with a more secure or anxious attachment style, avoidants haven't developed the internal tools to process emotion in real time. So when the suppressed pain starts to break through the cracks, it feels disorienting. They're not used to sitting with their feelings, they're used to outrunning them. And now, during no contact, there's nowhere to run. There's no one to blame in the moment, no conflict to point to, no distraction big enough to keep the feelings buried. And when that suppression system begins to collapse, avoidants can feel like they're losing control of their inner world. This is when emotional ambush happens. A deep longing or sudden grief might show up out of nowhere. They might replay conversations in their head they thought they'd forgotten. They might even start to remember the warmth or intimacy in the relationship, not because they suddenly miss the other person, but because their mind is trying to reconcile the disconnect between what they feel now and what they convinced themselves they didn't feel before. This period is confusing for them. The emotions they suppressed resurface without warning, and because they haven't been processed, they come back raw and unfiltered. The avoidant often has no language for what they're feeling. They don't have an internal map for vulnerability. And so instead of naming their emotions, they tend to act them out, withdrawing further, becoming short-tempered, feeling restless, or spiraling into overthinking. But they won't always link these reactions to the relationship or the no-contact phase. That's part of the challenge. Avoidants are so good at disconnecting from their emotional selves that when the pain returns, they don't always recognize it as something tied to missing someone or being hurt. They might chalk it up to stress, burnout, or just needing more space, when really what they need is to acknowledge what they've been running from. And because this emotional flood can feel so unfamiliar, it often gets mislabeled. Instead of sadness, they call it discomfort. Instead of grief, they call it pressure. Instead of love, they call it regret. But whatever name they give it, the truth is that no contact has started to strip away their emotional defenses. They've had time with themselves, time without distraction, time when no one was expecting anything from them emotionally. And paradoxically, that's when the emotions they buried begin to show up. Suppression isn't sustainable. It only buys time. And once that time runs out, avoidants are left face to face with everything they tried not to feel. Only now they're dealing with it alone. There's no one to help them unpack it, no partner to externalize it to, and often no self-awareness to guide them through it. And that's what makes this part of the process so difficult. Avoidants are not heartless. They are simply unfamiliar with the language of emotional expression. They default to shutting down, not because they don't care, but because caring, truly caring, feels like an emotional risk they don't yet know how to manage. And so during no contact, they walk around carrying a storm inside that they pretend isn't there, until one day the wind changes and they can no longer deny the emotional weather they thought they escaped. Avoidants often pride themselves on their independence. It's their emotional sanctuary, the place where they feel safest and most in control. From the outside, they appear self-reliant, confident, and even emotionally unshakable. They value autonomy, and in many cases, they've built their entire identity around the belief that needing others is a weakness. So when no contact begins, they retreat to this place of independence as if it's a protective shell. It feels familiar. It feels manageable. They can re-establish routines, fill their schedule, take on new projects, and convince themselves that they are thriving in the space. For a while, this can even seem like an emotional reset. With the tension and emotional demands of the relationship gone, they return to what they know best, relying on themselves and avoiding emotional vulnerability. There's no longer anyone expecting them to share their feelings, no pressure to navigate conflict or compromise, no daily reminders that another person exists in their emotional orbit. To them, this is relief. But what they don't often realize is that independence, while powerful, can quickly morph into isolation. And that isolation doesn't feel like strength for long. At first, the quiet is calming. The stillness feels like control. The distance allows them to stop confronting parts of themselves that relationships naturally expose. They can go days or even weeks telling themselves they're fine, that they're just getting back to who they were before the relationship began. But what they're really doing is disconnecting, not just from the other person, but from the parts of themselves that were awakened during the connection. No contact cuts off the supply of emotional stimuli they secretly depended on more than they realized. Even if they struggled with intimacy, the relationship gave them a mirror. It showed them things about themselves, desires, fears, habits, emotional limits. And now, in the silence, that mirror is gone. Independence becomes their refuge, but it also becomes a vacuum. With no one to challenge their thinking, support their vulnerability, or reflect their emotions back to them, they begin to feel a subtle emptiness creeping in. At first, they don't call it loneliness. They call it freedom. They tell themselves it's good to be alone, that this is where they do their best thinking and growing. But over time, the silence they once welcomed starts to get heavy. The solitude starts to echo. And what they begin to realize, though often without fully admitting it, is that their independence isn't filling the emotional gap. It's just masking it. The isolation starts to erode their emotional stability. Without the emotional feedback loop of a relationship, they lose touch with parts of themselves they could only access in connection with another person. They begin to notice that they're overthinking more, not less. That they're replaying moments from the past when they said they wouldn't. That they're searching for distractions that aren't quite doing the job. They may start reaching out to old friends, scrolling social media longer, watching shows that remind them of the person they're no longer speaking to, not because they want to re-engage, but because they're subconsciously trying to fill an emotional space that independence can't satisfy. And yet, despite this growing discomfort, they rarely let themselves name what's happening. They still equate emotional need with weakness. So instead of admitting they feel lonely or emotionally ungrounded, they double down on isolation. They keep saying they're better off alone. But the truth is they're in a tug of war between their need for connection and their fear of it. The more time they spend in no contact, the more that inner conflict begins to surface. They start to feel like something is missing, but they don't trust that feeling. They question themselves. Was the connection real? Were they truly happy? Could they have done more? But they stop short of exploring those questions deeply, because doing so would require them to confront a truth they've spent years avoiding. That real independence doesn't come from avoiding connection, it comes from knowing you can engage with it without losing yourself. But that's the part they haven't learned yet. So during no contact, avoidants often drift in a fog of disconnection. They act like they're in control, but beneath the surface, the weight of their solitude begins to press against the walls they've built. And the longer they go without emotional intimacy, the more they realize that independence without connection is not peace, it's emptiness. They begin to see that their most comfortable state isn't necessarily their healthiest one. That self-reliance without vulnerability becomes emotional starvation. But instead of facing this directly, many avoidants will suppress these realizations or rationalize them away. They'll tell themselves they're just tired, just overwhelmed, just in need of a break. But what they're really feeling is the slow erosion of emotional fulfillment, the kind that can only be experienced in the context of genuine human connection. And though they may not say it and may not show it, they begin to feel the sting of that absence in ways they aren't yet ready to admit. Avoidants have a complicated relationship with nostalgia, especially during no contact. In the early stages, they do their best to disconnect from the emotional weight of the relationship. They lean into their independence, suppress their emotions, and convince themselves that distance is exactly what they needed. But over time, something unexpected begins to happen. As the emotional intensity of the breakup fades and the pressure of closeness disappears, they start to remember the relationship through a softer lens. It's almost as if their mind begins editing the story, removing the difficult parts and highlighting the moments that felt safe, fun, or comforting. This doesn't happen right away because avoidants are wired to shut down emotions in the moment. But after enough time has passed and the fear of emotional entanglement is no longer active, their mind allows them to revisit memories without the same level of anxiety. And when that happens, they don't just remember, they idealize. They start to replay the times when they laughed with you, when you understood them in a way others didn't, when the connection felt easy and natural. They begin to romanticize the past, not necessarily because they want to reconnect, but because the emotional threat is no longer present. Without the immediate pressure of intimacy, they feel safe enough to revisit what was good. They start to see you differently, or rather they allow themselves to see what they once blocked out. In the relationship, emotional closeness felt overwhelming. It triggered old wounds, fears of being needed, fears of losing their autonomy. So even if they cared deeply, their instinct was to pull away. But now with space and time, they're no longer reacting to those fears in real time. Their nervous system has calmed down, and with that calmness comes clarity, or at least what feels like clarity. The irony is that many avoidants only realize the depth of their feelings after the connection is gone and the emotional stakes have been lowered. It's not that they suddenly develop feelings they never had. It's that they're finally able to face the feelings they suppressed when they were too overwhelmed to process them. And because they never fully dealt with those emotions at the time, they now feel raw, almost new. The longing that starts to creep in doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the parts of them that finally feel safe enough to miss what they once feared. The same emotional intimacy that scared them when it was present now feels like something they're craving. But this craving is selective. It's nostalgia with blind spots. They remember the closeness, but not the discomfort. They remember the connection, but not the responsibility that came with it. They romanticize the support, the warmth, the laughter, but they often forget how hard it was for them to let those things in when they had them. And that's why this stage of the process is so emotionally confusing for them. They start to question their own decisions. They wonder if they gave up something real. They ask themselves if maybe the other person wasn't too much after all, but rather that they just weren't ready. They might even begin to feel regret, but they don't always recognize it as such. Instead, it shows up as quiet reflection, as moments of sadness they can't fully explain, or as a lingering thought that maybe they pushed away something good without truly understanding it. They may not reach out or admit these thoughts out loud. Avoidants are still incredibly protective of their emotional vulnerability. But internally, there's a shift. What once felt like a justified exit now feels like an unresolved story. And because they haven't developed the emotional language to work through this nostalgia in a healthy way, they often stay stuck in this loop of looking back without moving forward. They might replay text messages, scroll through old photos, or hear a familiar song and suddenly be flooded with memories they had successfully ignored for weeks. They feel the pull, but they don't know what to do with it. Their inner dialogue becomes a mix of conflicting voices, one telling them they made the right choice, the other quietly wondering if they let fear make it for them. And because they're not talking to the person anymore, there's no external context to balance this internal monologue. So they keep everything inside, going over the same moments again and again, trying to make sense of what they're feeling without having to expose themselves to the possibility of rejection or vulnerability. What's happening here is that the emotional wall they built to protect themselves is beginning to thin. Nostalgia slips through the cracks, and with it comes emotional awareness they couldn't access before. They start to realize that the connection wasn't just about tension or conflict or emotional demands. It was also about being seen, cared for, and emotionally known in a way they rarely let people close enough to do. But instead of acting on this awareness, they often sit with it in silence, unsure of how to reconcile what they feel now with the choices they made when emotional proximity felt like danger. And so they continue to revisit the past in their mind, holding on to the memories, reliving the good moments, quietly longing for what once was. not necessarily because they want to rebuild the relationship, but because, for the first time, they feel safe enough to miss it. Avoidants carry a deep-rooted fear of vulnerability, and during no contact, that fear doesn't just go away. In fact, it often resurfaces in even more intense and conflicting ways. When they're in a relationship, the closeness, the emotional intimacy, and the expectations of emotional availability all trigger this fear. They may not show it openly, but inside, they're wrestling with a constant tension between wanting connection and feeling threatened by it. No contact removes that external pressure, but it doesn't resolve the inner conflict. It simply creates space, and in that space, all the fears they try to outrun have room to breathe and echo. At first, they feel relief because they're no longer being asked to open up, to express themselves, or to meet emotional needs. But as time passes and the silence grows, their fear of vulnerability transforms into something less obvious, but just as powerful: self-doubt, regret, and confusion. They start to question not only the relationship, but themselves. They wonder whether they were too closed off, too rigid, too quick to shut down. And because they never gave their full emotional self to the relationship, they're left wondering what might have happened if they had. This internal dialogue is rarely loud or dramatic. Avoidants process quietly, often internally, often in fragmented thoughts rather than full emotional awareness. But that doesn't make it any less real. The fear that once made them pull away now makes them question if they're even capable of healthy connection. They begin to see that they've been caught in a loop, one where every time closeness begins to feel safe, they retreat, and then once they're alone again, they feel the emptiness that closeness was beginning to soothe. During no contact, they may not admit to themselves that this is vulnerability rearing its head again. Instead, they often frame it in different terms. They feel unsettled, off balance, distracted. They might even become hyper-focused on things like productivity or routine to avoid facing the emotional discomfort that's starting to build. But underneath all the noise is that same old fear that being emotionally open will end in rejection, disappointment, or a loss of identity. The silence of no contact removes the relational stimulus but not the emotional wiring. They are still the same person with the same history and the same internal defenses. What makes this period so psychologically intense is that they no longer have the relationship as an emotional mirror. There's no one asking them to be open, so there's no excuse to avoid it. And yet the desire to be seen and known doesn't disappear. It lingers. It starts to whisper in moments of solitude, in flashes of memory, in dreams, in sudden pangs of missing someone they told themselves they didn't need. But to acknowledge those feelings would mean confronting the fear directly. And most avoidants aren't ready to do that, especially not without guidance or support. So what happens is an emotional stalemate. They want connection, but they can't fully admit it. They fear vulnerability, but they can't escape the longing that's tied to it. They begin to experience what feels like emotional whiplash. One moment they feel firm in their decision to stay distant, and the next they feel hollow, wondering what it would have been like to let someone truly in. And because they rarely open up to others about these thoughts, they stay stuck in their own mind, looping through the same fears without a clear way out. The longer this goes on, the more pressure it builds internally. They may even start to project these feelings onto future relationships, becoming more guarded, more suspicious of intimacy, more convinced that no one will truly understand them. But all of this stems from the unresolved vulnerability they never allowed themselves to face in the last connection. They fear getting hurt, yes, but more than that, they fear being seen and not being enough. They fear letting someone close only to have their walls penetrated and their emotional world exposed, and then still being left. That fear is so deeply ingrained that they'd rather avoid closeness altogether than risk the pain of being emotionally open and rejected. And during no contact, when the distraction of emotional interaction is gone, that fear grows louder. It's not drowned out by arguments or affection or demands. It's just there, sitting quietly beneath the surface. And though it may not always be obvious, it begins to shape their thoughts, their behavior, and their perception of the relationship they walked away from. They wonder if the vulnerability they avoided might have actually led to healing, if the connection they resisted might have taught them something they needed to learn. But rather than engage with those possibilities, they often retreat further, trying to rebuild their sense of control while carrying an unresolved emotional weight they don't quite understand. And so the cycle continues. Fear of vulnerability leads to disconnection, disconnection leads to emptiness, and emptiness leads to longing that they don't know how to express. All the while, the thing they want most, to feel safe in closeness, remains just out of reach, not because it's impossible, but because the fear is still louder than the desire to push through it.